Hello and welcome to another episode of Shattered Lives, Reach Ireland's crime podcast for the Irish Daily Star and Irish Mirror. I'm crime and defence editor Michael O'Toole. I'm joined as ever by our crime correspondent Paul Healy. Hello, Paul.
Hello, Mick.
Another very busy week for us.
Certainly has been, and it kicked off this week with, I suppose, what we would call the first gangland murder of the year, the murder of Josh Itseli.
Yes, and as so often happens, you get sniffs of things. We would call it a bit of a sniff of the thing. So I was heading to bed at about 10 to 1 on Monday morning when Twitter was agog with something happening in Drimna, Crumlin area. People were talking about the helicopter, talking about the Army EOD team, lots of guards, 5 cars involved and stuff. So I sent it a wee tweet going, look, and I did make inquiries and I was satisfied that there was a major inquiry. I believe somebody was dead at that stage. But it's not my job to confirm deaths, I suppose, really. So, and I was going to bed, and you don't want to be wrong, really. You know, it's this thing about being first. I'd rather be right than second. So I decided, right, look, I just sent out a tweet. I thought, right, we'll see what happens in the morning. And about 8 o'clock, I was sitting there actually in the morning. I was up at 7. I was going, why are the guards not announcing this? But they announced it at about 8 o'clock, and they did confirm that one man had been killed. So you were at the scene, Paul. What do we know?
Well, we know a lot more now than certainly we knew that morning, bank holiday, Monday morning. And it wasn't just because it was a bank holiday. This was an incredibly complicated murder. It isn't as straightforward even now. We've certainly are getting a better idea of where the way the Garda inquiry has gone. But when I arrived at the scene, so it's on the, I'm going to mispronounce it, the road. Someone's going to give out to me the Knocknarea Road there. Knocknaree, sorry, yes, road in Drimna. So this shooting happened like right outside a school there, in the heart of Drimna, not too far away even from the Crumlin Hospital. And when I got there to the scene in the morning, the body was still at the scene. A tent surrounded the body, and several roads were taped off. So there were multiple different scenes here. There was a hall just down the road which had a bullet. You could actually see a bullet had gone through the glass, front glass of the actual building. So that was all taped off. The road was taped off from every angle, basically. There's multiple different ways to get down to this because it's kind of a main road in the area. And the body was still lying there in a tent, as I said. So we knew very little. We knew that he was a young man. We didn't really know anything else beyond that at that point, other than it had all the hallmarks of a gangland shooting. When I got there to the scene, it was immediately apparent it was a chaotic scene because you could see 2 vehicles that appeared to have collided with one another. So there was a Volkswagen Golf and there was a Mercedes type vehicle, both of which were quite catastrophically destroyed, looked like they'd been in a head-on collision, and they were right next to where the tent was, where the body was.
What's it like being at scenes for you?
Well, I suppose you're going to probably say something similar. I think we've mentioned before on this podcast that it's quite eerie and quite silent when you get there. And it was. I mean, there was no one about. Now, that changed once it started to get more broadly reported. People come out and they get curious. They're kind of standing at their porches and looking down at the scene. That initial silence, and you've spoken about it before, is quite scary, and there's something just really odd about it. The fact that there's a dead body lying on the ground there and just complete silence.
Yeah, and you got there maybe 10 hours after the incident had happened. The earliest I've ever gotten to a murder, I'd say it was about 15 minutes, maybe 10 minutes after it happened. It was one of the, I don't think it's sub judice. I don't know if it's before the special, so I'm not going to say what it is, but it was very quickly after the murder. And there were, in the general area, there were probably about 150 people out, but it was silent. You would think that the ambulance had gone and there were no sirens. Sirens passed me on the way to it. I thought, Christ, better get there. But what struck me, and you mentioned it there, what struck me was that there were about maybe 100, 150 people out and about on the street, just complete silence.
Yeah. Now that changes, as I said, once the news kind of comes out and there are lots of people that are curious. my job on the ground, as is yours when you've attended these scenes, is to try and find out what happened and try and find out who the victim is. Um, uh, about an hour into it or so, I learned the name Josh Itseli. Things were starting to kind of piece together as to possibly what had happened that night. And so we now know, probably going back to your first question, what do we know? We now know that this appears to have been a dispute between, let's say, two rival gangs, very young people in the car with Josh Itseli. And they were on their way to, or it appeared to be that they were on their way to deliver a pipe bomb. Um, as for the motivation as to what that behind that, we still don't fully know. But they were on their way to deliver this pipe bomb when it appears that they were ambushed. You could see that ambush. Certainly the scene, as I said, was chaotic. You could see the collision. It appeared there had been some sort of an intervention between, when they were on their way to do something else. And in the chaos of that, Mr. Itseli was shot numerous times. Now, we were sent videos by locals, and they had all emerged on social media. You could hear the pop, pop, pop. You could hear multiple gunshots, and there were upwards of 20 shots fired that night. So a very, as I said, chaotic and violent scene. And it even sounded like, although we now know it wasn't, it sounded like a shootout. It sounded like two firearms going off, as though they were firing upon each other. We now think it was the same rifle.
Yeah, because you and I were talking about this because we were going, is it a shootout? Because there did appear to be a slight difference in the timbre between the first shots and the second. And I was going, I don't know, Paul, because it was so fast. I thought it was from one weapon or one firearm. What do we know about Josh Itseli himself?
Well, Josh Itseli, according to his family, was born here and grew up here and lived here and went to school here. He's 20 years of age. The family are originally from the Congo, and he has a mother and a father who I understand are separated and are living in a separate accommodation, one in the city centre and another in the Kylemore area of Dublin. And I know that Josh was living with his mother in the Kylemore area of Dublin. As regards to his criminal connections, we now know that Gardaí certainly knew who he was. He was on the Garda radar, and he was actually facing a charge, was due to be in court relatively shortly in relation to possession and sale or supply of cocaine, which we understand is to the value of €30,000. So he wasn't a nobody, he was a player, and he was certainly involved, it appears, in the drug scene in Dublin, and he was hanging out with some rather dangerous characters, some of whom were in that car.
And now there's a thing, guards will know this, Section 15A, which is the heavy sale and supply. I think he was just charged with sale and supply rather than 15A, but either way,
yes,
€30,000 of cocaine, almost half a kilo. That's a shed load of drugs. And I think it was up on the 22nd of March. He had two charges. 22nd of May, and he had two charges. So he was in real bother. Undoubtedly, he was looking at jail time in relation to that if he was convicted.
Yes, and it indicates that he was clearly up to his neck in the drug scene and involved. And there, as I said, there were individuals in that car, one of whom is quite well known to Gardaí and is himself facing trial for a very serious, violent alleged offence. And he was on bail when this incident happened. So he is one of the individuals that was inside one of the vehicles involved. So there's 4 vehicles involved in this incident. We think a van that managed to get away from the scene and a Ford Focus. So the Ford Focus, there were pictures of it. We went up to it. It was only up the road around the corner by the church there, Our Lady of Good Counsel. Smashed up Ford Focus. The 2 of the tires were burst, and it looked like it had hit every pole and every single curb on the way out as they basically tried to flee the scene. Armed Gardaí, members of the regional armed support unit, actually intercepted that vehicle and caught 3 lads. So 2 of them are adults and one of them is a teenager, and they were the lads that were arrested. We now know that they were actually with Josh Itseli, so they weren't the hit team as such, or the suspected hit team. They were with Josh Itseli. But in a subsequent twist, we now believe that in the chaos of this ambush, this intervention, that it was actually one of the lads in the car, one of the associates of Josh Itseli, who is now suspected to have been the one who fired off those shots. And we think that Mr. Itseli was killed either by accident or some sort of ricochet amid the chaos.
Yeah, I don't think that he was sort of betrayed by his own people. I think it was more chaotic than that. Essentially, can I just ask you? So the way I read it is, I think the Itseli team, put it that way, him and the three who were arrested, I think they were in two cars, and I think they were attacked by well, we can talk about this in a minute, by rivals or their targets in another car, and then the van perhaps was used by the targets who turned tables, shall we say, to escape. So that would account for the 4 cars. Then the guards also issued an appeal about it. Is it an electric bike?
Yes, which I believe has since been seized. There were a number of raids, and that bike has, I believe, been located. So there have been a number of searches as a result of that appeal. So
it's very complicated, but here's what I think happened. You and I worked in this together. Maybe you think the same. I think the Itseli, for shorthand, we're going to call them the Itseli team, okay? Because we can't name the other people, but one of them would be quite a significant young criminal.
Yes.
So I think the Itseli team were on their way, for whatever reason, were on their way to attack a target in the Crumlin Drimnagh area. Somehow the targets got to hear about this. My suspicion is that they may have been aware of a video, or there may have been some sort of Snapchat, we're coming to get you thing, because that's the only way really that we can explain this. Yeah. And we know that Josh did appear in a video earlier that day in another Mercedes, which I think had been stolen. Yeah. It's a younger version of a Mercedes, or newer version. Anyway, so what I think happened was they were in a 2-car convoy heading to do this hit, to attack the pipe, use the pipe bomb for an attack. They were wearing body armor as well, which is another issue. Their targets became aware and decided the best form of defense was to attack. So they became aware they were on their way, and they rammed them. In the subsequent confusion, one of the people with Itseli used this. It was an AR-15 style assault rifle, military grade rifle, shall we say. Opened fire accidentally or on purpose or whatever, and Josh died. So he was effectively killed by his own side.
Shocking stuff. But when you're dealing with a rifle of that caliber, and maybe you don't have, let's say, the technical skills to use it, perhaps maybe it's or the discipline, perhaps maybe it's understandable. And it, as I said, it looked a chaotic scene. Perhaps, in the chaos of that moment, unfortunately, Josh lost his life. And his friends, they fled that scene, probably for their own lives in one sense, but also Josh was just left there dying on the ground. And I believe members of Garda Síochána first to arrive to the scene, and then supported by Dublin Fire Brigade, tried to save Josh's life. You can actually see a video was shared on social media. You can see an officer performing CPR on him. So they did everything they could to save him there on the road. But you mentioned the AR-15. I mean, I think it's important to talk about this, because it is not every day that you see a rifle of this magnitude, this caliber being used, and how it was discovered even is very interesting. I mean, everything now is social media. We first saw this video, which ended up on TikTok, of this AR-15 rifle being taken down by Gardaí from a hedge. So it appeared to have been just hooked up into a hedge, and it may even have been discovered by young children who were actually there filming the actual discovery. So quite terrifying. You've got young kids, even if they weren't the ones who discovered it, they certainly were there filming this extremely dangerous rifle in the middle of a busy housing estate, just lying in a hedge.
So it's our job to know about these things. Now, we're not experts, but we have to explain things to people. I saw that video. I remember talking to you about that video, and 2 things came to my mind. The first one was, holy crap, that's a military grade rifle. What the fuck is that? Because I know there'd been some suspicion that it may have been a machine gun. This isn't a machine gun. It's a higher caliber. But I was thinking, look, an awful lot of pistols. Pistols are very popular in Gangland. They can go automatic. So I was thinking maybe the shots were from an automatic pistol or semi-automatic pistol. Once I saw that, I said, fuck me. Then the other thing I said, and I said this to you, how can we prove that is from the scene? But we did. We get to get it, what do you call it, geo-confirmed or geolocated. So then that really ratcheted things up. AR-15 is a fearsome firearm. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And think even for a second, the first responders, the first Gardaí on the scene, I would contend were rank and file uniformed Gardaí. So they have, there's a misnomer. You see the guards with their vests, and everybody calls them a stab vest. They're actually ballistic vests. So they have a certain level of bulletproof capability. 9mm pistols, they're supposed to be able to stop them from a certain range. They can stop shotguns, they can stop knives, can't stop needles, but they can stop knives and that sort of stuff. And, they offer a certain ballistic protection. So they're ballistic vests. The AR-15 would go through that. It would offer no protection. And the first Gardaí were probably uniform Gardaí with all that. So it was really worrying that a gang of young criminals, because there were young criminals, as you say, 20s and
very young,
had access to this weapon. And I spoke to Senator Tom Clonan, who's a former captain in the Defence Forces, and I wanted to talk to him about it. And he was extremely concerned about this. And he gave an example, right? The AR-15, you mentioned that there was a hole there and there was a bullet went through it.
Yeah.
The rounds from the AR-15, 5.56mm, they're NATO standard. They're used in battlefields. They would go through concrete walls and bricks. They would offer no protection. You try and hide behind a car, unless you're behind the engine block, zero protection. So say a 9mm effective range, 30 meters, 50 meters. The AR-15, whatever iteration it is, there's loads of different brands of it. That can reach up to 500 meters. Now, maybe the effective range is 300 meters, 400 meters, but that's military grade rifle, and it's fearsome, and it's been used. The AR-15, listeners will know this, it's been used in America in mass shootings. So do you remember Uvalde, the college in Texas? Do you remember Nevada, was it Nevada or Las Vegas, the fella shooting from up above?
Same rifle.
There's been a whole rake of them. I think Sandy Hook, really the infamous one, that was an AR-15 as well, an AR-style automatic rifle, so semi-automatic. So it's different gravy. And Gardaí are very concerned about it, and Senator Cronin was concerned about this. And we did a piece in the Star and the Mirror today. Only one unit within the Guards would have the capacity to take these on, and that's the emergency response unit. They have similar AR-15 style rifles. They're called HK416, they're Heckler & Kochs, but they're 5.56 and that have a similar range. But significantly, that emergency response unit also have what's called the level 4 body armor. So they would be able to stop. They have plates in the front and back, and they'd be able to stop rounds from a Kalashnikov or from a battlefield rifle or an AR-15. But every other Garda would be completely at the mercy of this. So it's extremely scary with these weapons. Yeah, it's really, and I was doing some research yesterday. 2 others have been seized. One in both in 2022. One in Dublin and one in North Dublin and another part. But that's 3. Now we know that the IRA, they've been called variants, would be called the Armalites in the 70s. We knew the IRA had them and all, but we're going down that road. This is different. This is young criminals with access to these. And the last time I checked was in 2008, and that was part of a Garda sting. AR-15 with other weapons were brought in as part of a sting operation against the Dundons in Limerick. So they're very rare, but that's 3 in the last 2 years have now been seized and be used by criminals. So it's very, very worrying.
Yeah, I'd say serious questions have to be asked now as to how they're getting them in. But also the most worrying thing is these extremely young criminals who don't know what they're doing have their hands on them. I mean, we've seen it now play out in the streets. If it appears that someone is after accidentally killing their own friend, I mean, it shows you that they have no control over these weapons, yet they have access to them. That is a terrifying thought. So hopefully the Gardaí are on top of it now. But just want to speak to the motive, because you mentioned, we had to be careful legally because this criminal associate that Mr. Itseli was with is facing charges and is before the courts. But I want to mention the fact that he was stabbed in an incident only last week while on bail. And, Gardaí are obviously looking at whether that perhaps provided the motivation for the gang to go out that day and to try and plant this pipe bomb and go out with the AR-15 in the first place. Now, that might turn out to have nothing to do with it, but, as you often say, don't believe in coincidences. This dangerous criminal was attacked, then they go out to commit this possibly revenge attack. They get ambushed, and sadly, he's now in the frame and suspected of possibly shooting and killing his own friend. So that's where we are with it.
And the difficulty is the gang who Mr. Itseli would have associated with. My understanding is they were around with a lot of people, but we do know who the targets were.
Yeah,
and they're 2 brothers, 2 young men themselves. And they are regarded, they're not regarded as gangsters. They're just regarded as what the guards would call gougers. So they're doing a lot of robberies, foreigners, stealing people's bikes, sort of street level crime. And now they've gotten involved in this. Now, I know the suspicion is they weren't armed. We thought they were armed, but the suspicion is that, just be clear on that. And there's evidence that only one weapon was discharged at the scene. But this is heavy, that they were involved in an incident in which somebody was killed and that there were a pipe bomb. Now, I know it was the opposition, but, it does ratchet things up somewhat.
It does. I'd say there is some frustration among the Gardaí as well. I mean, that this individual was granted bail. I mean, I think there were protestations from Gardaí last week. They were concerned about this person being out on the streets. And now he has become involved in this violent incident. That's a very sad state of affairs as well, that those pleas were ignored.
Yes, and just to point out one other thing, we're recording this on Wednesday, and earlier today, the three suspects, but I don't know if I mentioned this, they were all wearing body armor when they were arrested.
You
so
were.
That's another thing. Yeah. So they were all, they call it Section 30, so they were arrested under Section 30 of the Offences Against the State Act. That allows Gardaí 72 hours to hold them. That was on Monday morning. They were released without charge earlier today. But it's not the end. It is a long, and I presume it's going to be a complicated and technical investigation, but a file is being prepared for the DPP. So there could be movement on this in the coming weeks or months. We just really don't know.
So we'll move on now and we'll talk about the cash case, will we?
Yes, and just Paul, this is going to be very tough. So you want to issue just a warning for listeners?
Yeah, just a warning to anyone listening to this, and if you haven't followed it in the news yourself, this is a particularly harrowing case. Some of the details might be difficult for people to listen to, so if you want to skip ahead, we do talk about other topics after this, but just this might be particularly harrowing for some listeners.
Okay, so this is about a triple murderer, Andy Cash. So as I said, today is Wednesday. Yesterday, he received the mandatory life sentence for 3 horrific murders.
He did, yeah. Andy Cash, he's 26 years of age, and he has pleaded guilty to the murder of his siblings out in Tala on the 4th of September 2022. People might remember this horrific tragedy. That is Lisa Cash and her twin siblings, Christy and Chelsea Cawley, were brutally murdered by Andy Cash at the family home there in Rossfield Avenue in Tala. I just want to kind of cast people back to that time. I remember covering this case. I remember going to the scene. I am not that you try to categorize these things, but it's probably one of the worst stories that I have ever covered. It was so horrific at the time. I can even recall how that night, everyone on the road, so all the neighbors and friends, were gathered watching this tragedy unfold, basically seeing the Garda emergency response unit outside the house, pleading with Andy Cash. So he was in the top window of the house, and he was acting erratically and screaming and shouting, and the Gardaí were basically trying to get access to the house to try and save the people inside. And amidst all of this, Andy Cash was dangling his younger sibling, Christy, 8-year-old Christy, out the top window of the house by the legs, and he appeared to be lifeless. He may well have been, and more than likely was, dead at that point. And the Gardaí were basically pleading with him to stop. And sadly, he dropped the child, down into the front of the garden. And many, many people witnessed that. And I remember speaking to people about no one expects to see something like that. That entire street was traumatized by that.
It was a Saturday night, wasn't it? Sunday morning, I think, was it?
It's early hours of Sunday morning, yeah. And I recall then going out to the scene that morning.
So just to explain to listeners, you and I work opposite Sunday weekends. So I have a weekend off. You work the weekends. One of us is always on. And I remember talking to you. I remember hearing about it that night. And I remember it's some things you don't believe. And I remember being told, and there was evidence, and you mentioned that he threw the kid. Now, if we were told he threw the kid the child down the stairs, I couldn't believe that. But it actually, there was a version of it. Obviously, there's chaotic.
That was the sister.
Oh, the sister.
Yeah.
It's unspeakable. It's upsetting to think about this. It's upsetting that they were murdered, but just that is so callous.
It's callous and it's very hard to get your head around. And even now, after Andy Cash has finally pleaded guilty 2 years, nearly 2 years later, we'll never know the full answers as to what happened here. There was some evidence heard, but when a person pleads guilty, look, the family are spared a trial. And in many ways, I'm sure they're grateful for that because all of the detail doesn't have to come out. But we've got enough detail here. And some of it, as I said, is harrowing to know kind of essentially the background of what happened. And there appeared to be some sort of occasion that Andy Cash and his mother and other family members were attending nearby. It was an anniversary for a relative passed away, and there was some alcohol being consumed at this, and there was some sort of a row or a dispute with Andy Cash because he was saying, oh, this is what the court has heard, some controversial things, and those controversial things and uncomfortable things basically led to him leaving that particular party and getting into a taxi and going back then to the family residence in Rossfield Avenue. So I can recall this even myself, that Chelsea, the 18-year-old, Andy's sister, she was actually babysitting the three younger siblings in the house at the time, and the court heard that she was sitting there watching Netflix when Andy Cash came home, and that Christy and Chelsea were asleep in their beds at the time. He came into the house at some point, armed himself with a very sharp blade knife, and he attacked his siblings essentially in an erratic, psychotic manner. He stabbed them multiple times, and I do mean multiple. Christy had 107 sharp force injuries before he was thrown out the first floor of the window. Chelsea was stabbed and slashed 65 times. So you're talking catastrophic, multiple injuries, sadly, but they were brutally murdered. And as you mentioned, the young girl, the 18-year-old girl, was thrown down the stairs, was found at the bottom of the stairs. And then there was an altercation between the ERU and Andy Cash. He was throwing a television out the window. He was saying all sorts of nonsense and wasn't playing ball. And eventually, the Gardaí got inside, used non-lethal force to subdue him, and he was arrested and had been in custody ever since, and has now, as I said, spared the family a trial at least, pleading guilty, and ultimately has apologised through his barrister for his actions.
And I think that's Brendan Grehan, actually, isn't it?
It was Brendan
to the pod.
Yeah,
I've said this before. Sometimes when I'm not directly working on the stories, I try not to read them just to protect yourself because it's so hard. But I listened to Orla O'Donnell on RT News yesterday, and I found the victim impact statement horrific.
Incredibly powerful. Powerful. The victim impact statement was read out on behalf of the family, I believe on behalf of the mother, so Margaret McDonough, who's known as Twink, and her daughter Margaret as well, who was in her 20s. I remember interviewing Margaret previously. She is one of the surviving children. There's also another child who actually managed to survive the incident, a younger child who jumped out of a back window of the house, and I think at the time broke his leg or something to that effect, but has survived the incident. So they've all been deeply traumatized by that. I'm just going to read out some of the victim impact. You can read the whole thing if you go and look up the article. But just a couple of things that stood out to me. Miss McDonough said, "Our three innocent children were viciously taken from us, and that was the day the world stopped turning. What is left is our broken family, and every day since has been unbearable." She said, "No amount of time a person can spend in a jail cell will justify what happened to our family. It's not just 3 lives that were taken that day, but 6. We are no longer the people we were when they were alive, as we died with them that day."
Hard to get over it. I don't know. God love that family. How can any family ever? I don't know
how can recover from it, and they've been incredibly stoic. They have moved on. I mean, I was down at the scene today where it unfolded, and the house is still completely adorned with tributes. There's a big picture of the kids still outside the front door of the house. There are teddy bears and flowers and tributes to them still outside the house, but they've been there a long time, you can tell. And the house is boarded up and nobody lives in it, and nobody has lived in it since. The family never returned to it. So it's kind of a constant reminder for the whole street as to what happened nearly 2 years ago. And the family, I recall, there was an anniversary that we attended, an anniversary mass, and they invited us up to the grave. And they had it's a very impressive grave. I mean, it's an incredible tribute to the children, and the entire family were there. The mother was there, and I spoke to their older sibling Margaret, and I interviewed her at the time, and she was incredibly brave and stoic amidst everything. But even then, I think I remember her saying, "We don't know how to move on from this." So hard to go out to them. I mean, it's a tragedy beyond imagination. It really is, and hopefully we never see anything the likes of it again.
Mm-hmm. So as you say, he pleaded guilty. So he received the mandatory prison sentence. Now, I again, just listening to Orla O'Donnell's piece, I thought the judge made an interest. It was Mr. Justice Paul McDermott, and he made an interesting comment. But let's just examine this for a second. Life in Ireland is what's called an indeterminate sentence. So I was taking notes there. There's a man in England called Wayne Couzens, rogue police officer who raped and murdered Sarah Everard. And he was given what's called a whole life tariff. So he was told, you're never getting out. In Britain, when they're sentenced to life sentence, the judge gives a tariff and says, I sentence you to life, but you will serve a minimum of 15 years. You will serve a minimum of 22 years or whatever. Doesn't happen here. You get an indeterminate sentence. What does that mean?
Well, I mean, we just don't have the laws that they have in the UK. We don't have a whole life sentence. So, a life sentence, in theory, it means life. You serve it for life. I mean, even if you are released from prison, you're still technically considered to be a life prisoner. So it is indeterminate. It means that he will be assessed all throughout. Within 12 years, he will be allowed to apply for parole. And then every 2 years after that, he will be able to apply for parole and be considered as to whether he has in any way changed his ways, engaged with courses, and had any kind of reconciliation or admission for what he'd done. But the average life sentence now has greatly increased. I mean, you used to be able to get out of prison after 14, 15 years. Now, on average, it's gone up to, I think, 22 years. So we've gone from 19, 20, 22. So I think it's up to 21 years now is the average life sentence.
So Mr. Justice Paul McDermott, who, by the way, was also the trial judge in the Anna Creasel case. So he doesn't have any power in relation to how long or when Ash can get out. But he did make an interest, just listen again to Orla's piece. He did sort of make a comment along the lines of, it's 3 murders, so whoever decides will have to take that into account when they are deciding if he should get released.
That's a huge thing to take into account. Another thing that I think is just odd, and again, it's just the way that our law is structured. He's serving those 3 life sentences concurrently, so he's serving them all at the exact same time. I'm always taken back to comments made by John Whelan, whose sister Sharon Whelan and her children were murdered by Brian Hennessy Christmas Day. Again, concurrent 3 life sentences that Hennessy got, and John Whelan always says, well, which life mattered more? Because can you tell me which life mattered more? Because he's only really serving one sentence for one life. I mean, that's the way he sees it. He's serving 3 life sentences, but at the same time, and it's the same with Andy Cash. It's strange that we just don't have a system where someone can serve 3 consecutive life sentences, because, as you say, it's indeterminate, so it wouldn't really make any sense to do so. And I'm also taken back to the most recent case, the trial of Joseph Puska, where the trial judge there, Mr. Justice Tony Hunt, also expressed a frustration that this was the only sentence that he had within his power to give, a life sentence, and that he said it was high time that there was a conversation in this country to bring in something like a whole life tariff. But that again is something that's outside of his power. That's something that's going to happen. I guess through the Iraq, just through the government, that conversation will have to be had. There had to be a legislation brought forward for something like that to be brought in.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I think there was an indication that Justice Minister Helen McEntee is sort of working and preparing
Considering
some legislation for that. But I think you mentioned Joseph Puska. I think people of Ireland, which is really what is important, I think they can be confident that neither Puska or Andy Cash will get out after 21 years.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think there are more, I mean, there's more consideration now with the parole board and the prison service as to how to handle those more severe cases. We often hear about, say, Joe O'Reilly. I mean, it would be a brave Minister for Justice or parole board that ultimately signs off on Joe O'Reilly's release, for example. So, I mean, there are some more infamous characters who may, I'm not going to say never, but who may be very, very old before they're ever released.
Well, you mentioned O'Reilly. O'Reilly was jailed in June 2007. So that's almost 17 years. And there's no indication he's anywhere near close to release.
No.
And, you've done a few stories about Brian Meehan, convicted of the murder of Veronica Guerin. How long has he been in custody? 27 years, is it? 25 years?
You're putting me on the spot, but 20 plus years anyway.
More than 20 years.
Yeah.
And I know he's in Shelton Abbey in Wicklow, the open prison. But I'd say there's still a while for him to do in prison before he gets out. So,
I'd imagine so. And you can spend a lot of time in those open facilities. We've done a couple of stories about prisoners who've been released after 40 years. So, it can happen.
Well, we talk about somebody who didn't get a prison sentence.
Yes, well, this is one that's, I suppose, created a lot of controversy on social media, and I do think we're close to a kind of a watershed moment here of real public anger and frustration as to the way in which sexual offences are, and we've talked about this on the pod, the way that they are dealt with in the law. But Niall Colgan, yes, he's a 39-year-old former Department of Justice official and spokesperson for the Department of Justice. You and I would have had dealings with him over the years. I mean, he was a spokesperson. He'd be someone you'd be ringing up for potentially a comment. He was caught in February of 2022 with what we're going to term as child sexual abuse material. There is another, it's called child pornography in law, but
we can talk about that.
We'll talk about that. But he ultimately pleaded guilty to one count of possession. That's 2 indecent videos and 2 indecent images, and that the offence occurred at his address in Dublin there on the 1st of February 2022. The court heard when he ultimately was interviewed by Gardaí that he never touched any children. He said it's all a fantasy, and the photos of the children were taken from TikTok and Instagram. And yeah, as you mentioned, Judge Martin Nolan handed him a suspended sentence, so a 1-year sentence, suspended in full, and that was basically on the basis that Judge Nolan said that he felt that he was remorseful, that it was unlikely that he would offend again, that he was once a person of stature, he had a good job, and that he again pointed to the remorse, and then also interestingly to the ridicule, as he said, and the harassment that Niall Colgan received upon this coming into the news in the first place. He said that the court had heard that the word pedo had been spray painted on his home, that he had been followed twice from the CCJ to his home, and that basically he had that unlawful things had happened around him. But he ultimately felt he was unlikely to reoffend, and he said that it would be unjust to jail Niall Colgan.
Have you ever seen any illegal images on TikTok?
Well, no, I
No, me
haven't gone.
neither.
Yeah,
So no, what I'm
haven't
saying
gone. I
is,
suppose you'd have to go looking for them, wouldn't you?
but that's my point. It's not as
Yeah,
if you sit there and you're scrolling past some fella talking about football or here's
mm,
my favorite dinner, and suddenly
yeah,
you see,
yeah.
child sex abuse material. So,
Hmm.
you know, I'll just make that point. And secondly, the videos from the evidence pretty serious. They were
They were
prepubescent
bad.
children. A
Yes.
girl. I won't go into what she was doing, but she was committing a sex act,
Hmm.
and she was a
Yeah,
child. She
yeah,
was a fucking child.
and the other involved a boy under the age of 10.
Yeah. So look, I don't know. I mean, I thought it was interesting that few weeks last week there was a story. I know it had been a few weeks earlier. A former RTE producer or backroom person, was
Yes.
jailed for
Yeah.
possessing a small amount of child sex abuse material.
Hmm.
Uh, so I have to say, I was surprised by him being jailed because most of the child sex abuse material cases that I cover, and I've been writing about this for 20 years since the law came in 2001 more. I don't remember that many men. It's men. I can't remember that many men being jailed for this.
It doesn't tend to happen. Look, I've got to be careful here because, we cannot really comment on the judiciary in terms of, criticism, and it's not for us to give our opinion necessarily either, but I should definitely mention the fact that there has been a lot of criticism around the way this case and other cases have been handled. But I think, and I'm not leaping to anyone's defense here, but I think that the law is, I don't know, I suppose if people have an issue with it, it needs to be updated. The way that child abuse material, the way that that offence is handled, typically when a person is caught, and especially if it's their first time
Mm-hmm.
offence, they're just not jailed.
They are. That
But
happens. Yeah.
I do wonder, and again, I'm not making any defence for it, but I do wonder if it was a jailable offence, would the jails be fuller than they already are? Because I mean, there are people caught, and sadly, this is a disgusting fact, but there are people caught with this material every day of the week.
There are. How many cases have we covered? It's a huge problem. And I
Mm.
spoke, and in the last pod, I spoke about the interview I did with Commissioner Drew Harris, Garda Commissioner Harris, when he was talking about children being exploited online. I mean, I said this. He looked very concerned, and it was mentioning children being forced to abuse other children online and coerced and that sort of stuff. But it is child sex abuse material. Now, so it's very. But I remember talking to one investigator in this, and he said, just it's fucking everywhere. It is
Mm.
just a huge problem. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, men would go to Amsterdam and come back with some magazines or some videos. Now you can do it in the safety of your
Mm.
house. And I wasn't in court for this, but I've covered plenty of cases where people would say, look, my state of mind, it was the state of mind. And,
But
and
that's
that,
what happened
is
here.
that, yeah, okay.
Yeah, well, I was there for the sentencing, and they mentioned that as part of what was put in Niall Colgan's defence was the isolation as a result of the pandemic, overuse of alcohol and cannabis. By the way, there was a small amount of cannabis found in his
Uh,
home. Resulted in what was called a downward spiral, and it was pointed out that the Gardaí found a small amount of child abuse material, but a large quantity of adult porn on his devices. It was pointed out.
what sort of spiral do you need to be in to go, right, I'm going to go and look at a child being abused?
I just can't understand it either. Yeah,
How the fuck does that make sense? But a couple of
mm,
points. You're right. We did have. I can only remember speaking to him once. Seemed like a normal fella, and
mm,
that's the reality of child sex and
mm,
abuse material. It is normal men. It is
mm.
normal men who do this. So, what did you think of him?
Yeah, well, again, I only a handful of
Mm.
dealings with him, but yeah, always very, very friendly and courteous, and would, if you had a request, he would get back to you. Yeah, didn't have any kind of personal relationship with him, but just a professional one, like anybody else. But I noticed that he had his head down in court,
Mm.
never looked up, looked quite ashamed and embarrassed to be there. And I did note that he was supported in court by his parents and his partner, who were with him throughout. Everyone knows what he looks like. There's plenty of photos of him. So I often find this weird when people do this. But when he came out of the courtroom, having just been told you're not going to jail, he stood around for quite a bit, seemed to be in a bit of a panic as to how he was going to handle walking out of the court. And then ultimately, he was suited and booted. He had glasses on. He took the glasses off. He took the tie off. Tried to kind of alter his appearance a little bit, and then put a face mask on, and then eventually went out with a team of people, and got heckled and abused outside by one or two people, and then rushed into a car. But I found it odd that he even tried to conceal his appearance. I guess there's still a bit of shame and embarrassment, and maybe hope that people will forget what he looks like. I don't think there's any, I don't think there's any real chance of that, especially given the position that he had. And I think a lot of people are concerned about that. He was in he was in the Department of Justice, so it's a really bad look, But look, he gets to go on now and live his life, and hopefully he won't reoffend.
And, his parents and partner are entitled to love the sinner, but not the sin. They're entitled to do that. That's no true. Problem. Yeah. And that was actually, I heard that phrase in relation to another child sex abuse material case I covered a long, long time ago. But anyway, he first came to the public attention when I doorstepped him. So we're going to talk about doorstepping him. I knew what he looked like. It's always quite difficult because Mick O'Neill, our famous photographer, we always talk about. I was doing the door knock. Mick was taking the photograph. That's the way it works. You see it, we always doorstep people, and you got to get a picture. So we got him. So he came to the door, and I'm going to read out the transcript because I just think it's really interesting.
Gives you an insight.
Yeah. So I was there for about 30 seconds. Somebody else answered the door, and I said, "Hi, can I speak to Niall?" Yeah, 1 second. Right. So I said, "Niall." He went, "How you doing?" And I said, "Mick O'Toole from the Star." He knew who it was because, he goes, "How you doing?" And I go, "You know why I'm here?" And he went, "Nope." And I said, "You were up in court a few weeks ago." At this stage, he had already been charged and had appeared. We were breaking that he was charged.
It wasn't in the news.
Yeah, it hadn't been, we published it. He goes, I said, "You were up in court a few weeks ago." And he went, "Thanks, Mick." And I said, "Would you like to say anything?" "No." And I said, "Look, I know you were in court." And he went, "Cheers." And I go, "All right." So it's a bit weird. But that's our job.
He didn't expect that call, obviously.
And I had a bit of a panic. Okay, we got the picture.
Is it him? Is it him?
Yeah, because you know what? I didn't go, "Can I speak to Niall Colgan, please?" I said, "Can I speak to Niall?"
Yeah.
I should have said Niall Colgan. I always do that.
Yeah.
But I knew it was him because I'd only met him. I think I'd only met him once, actually. And that's him. You still have that panic, but just that brazenness. Why did you not say, "Oh, yeah, the game's up"? Because I knew he was charged. No, none to say. Good luck.
Well, we went out to the address today, actually, that you knocked on, but he appears not to be there. All the blinds are down. I suppose if he's wise, he's not going to be there for some time. He's probably moved on. But this is, make no mistake, there is a punishment that comes with this, a societal punishment. I mean, yes, he didn't get jail, but he will be forever known as a pedophile, sex offender. He is on the sex offenders register. As the court heard, his house has been targeted. Okay, that is a criminal offence, but that brings with it a sort of a stigma. So I imagine he feels some sense of punishment, and even I believe he lost home insurance and has to get different home insurance, and so this has affected him in some way.
And his career is banjaxed. And
his career is gone. He was suspended from his position at the Department of Justice, and he's since resigned.
Yeah, so he won't be in a nice wee office again.
No, but he apparently is working in education, so I don't know.
Oh, yeah. I noticed that actually he's doing a TEFL course. So a TEFL course is teaching English as a foreign language, because I was going to do that before I was silly enough to become a journalist. So, who's going to teach? Is he going to teach adults? Is he going to teach kids? And by the way, there's two possibilities. He can teach people coming into Ireland who need to learn English, or he can fuck off overseas. A friend of mine has just moved to Italy to be an English teacher. He did TEFL, so maybe he could skedoodle.
I don't know. I think there's a wider discussion to be had here, and probably by people smarter than us, about how these things are handled, how sex offences are handled. And I don't just mean possession of child abuse material. But, I mean, Judge Martin Nolan gets a lot of criticism on social media. Um, I just want to point out that Judge Martin Nolan sits in the circuit court there in the Central Criminal Court in Dublin. So whenever you read about Judge Martin Nolan, or why people keep going, oh, it's Judge Nolan again. Well, Judge Martin Nolan is probably the only judge who hears he's the judge who hears the majority of these cases. There are cases that happen elsewhere in the country, but most of these cases that are publicized all end up in Judge Nolan's court. So that's why you keep hearing about it. I don't know if it's necessarily going to be different with it. Okay, you've mentioned one case, how a judge handled it differently. Judges can handle things differently, but even still, how first-time offences are handled is usually you do get a suspended sentence. So I do wonder, if it was a different judge, would it really be that much different? I don't know.
I would agree with you.
I just think Judge Nolan is the guy that sits in that court, and so he's getting the abuse on social media, but that is just the law. It's the way the law is the problem. If you have a problem here, it is the way in which our statute is set up. It's not necessarily an individual.
Yeah, and speaking of law, we call it CSAM. It's legally known as child pornography. But here's the point, and I was ranting about this last night. There's nothing to stop. There's no law just because it is called child pornography. The media don't have to refer to it as child pornography. And I have been heartened that even, you go on Twitter or on Google and I typed in Niall Colgan's name, and I didn't see any news report that referred to child pornography. In the highlight, it was all child abuse material, child sex abuse material. So I'm heartened by that. I think, it's up to the media. Never mind. The way I do it is I call it CSAM, or child sex abuse material, and then I say further down what is legally known as child pornography.
Yeah, I think that's a better way to handle it, because and again, it shows you that our law is perhaps outdated and it needs updating, because the word pornography just makes it sound benign, and it certainly isn't that. It's anything but that.
It's children being abused for men to sexually satisfy themselves over. That's what it is. And it's not, there are different grades, and some of it, I'm not even going to say, but there are grades when it is torture and animals being involved. And, we're talking month-old babies, up to preteen. It's fucking horrific. And calling it kiddie porn or child porn minimizes it.
It does. Probably shouldn't give our opinion too much, but I think we can probably agree on that. Yeah.
No, but yes, look, I think in this case, it's more, we're not opinionizing, we're pointing out the ramifications of using language. And there are significant damages to children. They're not AI, they're children somewhere in Singapore, in Ireland, in Malaysia, wherever. There are children being abused. I'm not talking about the Colgan case because I don't know where they were from. But in the case, vast majority, in cases of child sexual abuse, there are children, by its very nature, being sexually abused online.
Somewhere in the world.
Yeah.
It's important to point that out. That's why it's difficult when you see it minimized and being put down to a scale. It's on the lesser end of the scale. It's difficult to read that. But look, I think there's a wider political discussion to be had. It's not necessarily down to one particular judge. I think there needs to be a discussion around the way that our law handles these types of cases. That's just my opinion, which I'm not supposed to give. But anyway.
We can give our analysis, Paul. Okay.
Shall we leave it there
for the week? Yeah. Tough week.
It has, yes. So look, we'll see what next week has in store. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everybody.